During the Second World War, as most of Europe was set ablaze, some countries sought to remain neutral so as to save themselves from the ravages of war. However, neutrality did not always guarantee safety, and this was certainly true for Portugal, a country that was put under immense pressure from both the Allied and Axis powers. Despite being a secondary power and placed on the westernmost corner of Europe, Portugal possessed a sprawling empire with two very large colonies in Africa, Angola and Mozambique, plus three small enclaves in Asia, Goa in India, Macau in China, and East Timor in Southeast Asia. It would be in Timor that Portugal was unwillingly shoved into the Second World War. East Timor, or Timor-Leste in Portuguese, was the Lusitanian half of the island of Timor, the other half belonging to the Netherlands and their colony of the Dutch East Indies. East Timor was poorer than its Dutch counterpart and was inhabited by 450,000 Timorese natives, plus a few hundred Portuguese settlers. The colony was only lightly defended by around 200 colonial troops. In the interwar period, Portugal was ruled by Prime Minister but de facto dictator Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who strengthened the empire and declared that all of Portugal's colonies were in fact integral parts of the nation. In the 1930s, Timor was the theater of competing Japanese and Australian geopolitical interests, with Britain seeing the island as a potential springboard for the invasion of Australia if it were to fall into the hands of the Japanese. In 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Netherlands declared war on Japan. In order to better defend the Dutch East Indies from invasion, on the 17th of December, a combined Dutch-Australian force occupied Portuguese Timor. In Lisbon, Sir Ronald Campbell, the British ambassador, informed Salazar of Timor's occupation. The Portuguese dictator was furious and protested the violation of Portugal's neutrality. In reaction, an 800-strong expeditionary force was sent from Mozambique so it could garrison Timor without the help of the Allies. However, events quickly precipitated. On the 10th of January 1942, the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies, and between the 19th and 20th of February had landed in Dili, the capital of East Timor, scattering Dutch and Australian troops, some of which stayed behind as guerrillas. On the 9th of March, the Dutch surrendered to the Japanese. The expeditionary force that had departed from Mozambique was forced to reroute and dock in Portuguese Goa. The Japanese authorities initially respected Portugal's neutrality, but they soon suspected the Portuguese of cooperating with the Allies. The Japanese enacted harsh repressive measures, forbidding the Portuguese officials from administering their colony and effectively cutting off all communications with Lisbon. In the first 6 months of the occupation, the Japanese army executed 26 Portuguese civilians on suspicion of aiding the Australian guerrilla forces. In protest, the Portuguese governor, Manuel de Carvalho, refused to continue in his post and declared himself a prisoner of the Japanese. The Japanese occupation was a dark page in Timor's history, with more than 40,000 Timorese, about 10% of the population, being killed. Given this situation, it is surprising that Portugal did not declare war on Japan. In reality, Portugal was in a very delicate position, having as its neighbor the very pro-Axis and Anglophobic Spain, governed by General Franco. Any move to join the Anglo-American war effort might have provoked a German invasion of the country aided by the Spanish. In Lisbon, the government was engaged in lengthy negotiations with the Japanese ambassador, Morito Morishima, to try and safeguard the interests of the Portuguese settlers, but these talks often came to nothing. Portugal's neutrality did not forbid the local Portuguese from aiding the Allied cause. One notable example of this was Lieutenant Manuel de Jesus Pires, a Portuguese official who helped evacuate hundreds of Portuguese civilians to Australia during 3 dangerous missions. Whilst in Australia, Pires tried to enlist the aid of both Salazar and the President of Brazil, Getulio Vargas, to retake East Timor. In 1944, during his last mission, Lieutenant Pires was captured by the Japanese and died in captivity. But there were also those amongst the Timorese who fought against the Japanese occupation. Naisacio, better known as Dom Alexio, was a Timorese chieftain loyal to Portugal who fought guerrilla actions against the Japanese invaders. In 1943, Dom Alexio was captured and executed with his entire family, his story being heavily promoted by the Portuguese colonial authorities after the war. Fighting against Dom Alexio were also Timorese chieftains who sided with the Japanese to overthrow their old Portuguese colonial masters. The pro-Japanese Timorese auxiliaries were nicknamed the Colunas Negras, or Black Columns. In the end, Japanese troops continued to occupy Timor until Japan's surrender in September 1945. In that month, the Portuguese governor of Timor, Manuel de Carvalho, who had remained a prisoner throughout the entire occupation, formally welcomed a party of Australian troops to Dili. Portugal would retain East Timor until the demise of the Salazar dictatorship in 1975, when the colony declared independence. Celebrations were, however, cut short when on the 7th of December 1975, Indonesia annexed East Timor. Many East Timorese saw this as a violent suppression of their right to self-determination. The tensions between the Indonesian government and the local people would eventually lead to the East Timorese genocide in the 1980s and the eventual second independence of East Timor in May 2002.